Hi everyone, I'm Andrea, or Andy. Most people call me Andy. And I'm going to introduce myself because I feel a little bit awkward when people introduce me. So I'm a design strategist. I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into what that means to me in a bit. But I'm a design strategist, which means that though I have a background in film and in games, I use design to tackle mostly social issues. That means that I've tackled problems like, what is the future of mobility when cars are already gridlocking cities like New York City? So I did that with Ford. Or how can we work on creating climate change policy for the Amazon? I did that with the United Nations. So it's kind of like these big problems, right? These big, wicked problems that you can't solve unless you work with other disciplines. And that's where I become more of a strategist than necessarily a designer. But the interesting part for me, or what interests me most and has always interested me a lot, is how can I use this in games? And specifically, not because I want to make games for change or games that tackle social issues, but rather because I feel like our industry has a lot of issues that need design. So I'm more interested in the systems that surround the way we make games, necessarily, than the making of games. And that might seem a little bit complex, so I'm gonna kind of like distill that and see what design could be for our industry. Also, there's my Twitter endpoint. You wanna hear more about what I'm talking about today. So the first thing that I think is really important for anyone that's interested in design is learning how design has been evolving lately. And I say this because I've realized that in game design, sometimes we're sheltered from the bigger conversations that are being had outside that relate to design, right? So if you look at where design's going right now, you'll notice that right now we have different types of design, some that are more into the creation of tangible things or symbols, like graphic design, industrial design, right? You're making things that people can touch. Many times we put games in that when we look at games as products, right? We're making a game, therefore we're game designers. But the interesting thing is that as design has evolved throughout the years, what we're going more and more into is into this like whole idea of we can design interactions, we can design services, we can design experiences, and the latest thing that people are talking about is we can design systems. And in that whole area of designing systems, mostly people have been talking about, like I told you a little bit before, how can we design systems for social change, or how can we design public policy, how can we design new ways of organizing business, right? So this last part is where most of the design innovation talk is going to right now. So instead of staying in the graphic part or the making a product part, designers outside the games industry are going more and more into, we should be making bigger experiences. We should be looking at what is wrong with society or what we want to change in society and try to intervene that. So to give you a little bit more of background in this, I don't know if you guys have heard of design thinking. It's been talked a lot about in the design community, and lately the Harvard Business Review even made a huge spreadsheet on it, and everyone was like gasping because of it. And basically design thinking is this idea that designers have something special about them that leads to them being able to fail faster and to iterate and prototype and be able to look at a huge problem and make it into smaller chunks. Which I think if there are game designers in here, you'll realize that you're always doing that, right? You're always looking at something really complex, like what an audience wants and what I can actually get to do with my engineer and look at all these constraints and make them into a thing that works, right? So many people in the design industry are calling this design thinking. And actually the first people to talk about this, and you should look into this after my talk, but the first people to give this a name, not the first, but the ones that do it the most are called IDEO. So IDEO is this design agency, design consultancy that has worked on big issues like the ones I just told you about, like climate change, and how can we redesign education in San Francisco, and how can we design the future of mobility. And so the interesting thing is that they've been creating this whole ethos of this is what a designer looks like, right? And so they've been creating this idea of like, you have wide open spaces and you have a lot of post-its and people are collaborating with each other. And that's actually how people are starting to look at design outside of game design. We do that too, but seriously, if you ask people what they think a designer looks like in the design industry, they will talk a little bit about this. There's kind of like a little bit of a fetish with like post-its and Sharpies, and if you want to give a designer a gift, it should be Post-its and Sharpies. But the cool thing about IDEO and the whole idea of design thinking is that thanks to that, they've been able to talk about design in a way that people understand. And they created this idea of, well, actually design thinking is you empathize with a user, you define what the need is, after you define what the problem is, you can create ideas, then you prototype it, and then you test it. What's interesting about this to me as a game designer is that we don't work like that. Or if we do, it can change, right? Sometimes we don't need to know what the user is doing because we're always debating like, is game design an art? Is it more about like expressing myself instead of going to a user, right? This whole idea of, are we art? Are we science? Are we art? Are we entertainment? Whereas IDEO is going more towards, yeah, we're gonna tackle huge problems through this idea of we can empathize with people and think as designers. And we're gonna create how the future of a car will look like. So in the future, we will have office spaces that move on wheels and people can just like go work by the beach. And they're generating these huge projects to think about systems. So design in the design industry is becoming more and more known as the devising of curses of action to move from existing to preferred situations. And the reason this is going to tie up in a little bit, but the reason I'm introducing you to this is so different from the way we see it, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but this is so interesting. Like, what is happening in the design industry that people are talking about it in this way? So in many ways, they're saying design must go beyond the boundary of disciplines and go more and more into the strategic. I already talked a little bit about what I do, but I thought it would be interesting for you guys to get a little bit more of a taste of where these things can go. So I recently graduated from Parsons in a program called Transdisciplinary Design. What we do basically is kind of like design strategy. And these are a few of the theses that have come out. That one had to do with, can we work with teenagers in underserved communities for them to imagine future ways for justice and courts to work so that racial bias can be broken. So that one's really cool. We have another one about what could the future of education look like if kids were actually asked to be a part of the design of their own education. This one, I would like to have a conversation about race. Is like pretty straightforward, but this girl created spaces in bars for people to talk about race, which is a really uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. Then we had non-living stakeholders, which was about like, what if we could have a service where people just like rent their own cups, and cups have rights, and so that way you don't throw them away as much. So you have a union of objects that are non-living. Narrative of post-displacement was about the Syrian refugees and how can you overlay a layer of infrastructure on the city so that people are thinking about the Syrian experience of having to be in exile in many ways. Nudge by Redesign was about, and I'm just throwing this out there because it's amazing, I love my classmates. Nudge by Redesign is about how can we make sexual assault visible. So this classmate created a bunch of signs that would be in the public on roads that would say, beware, there's catcalling here, or beware. And women would be the ones that were able to put that in like working construction spaces or places like that to signal them. A book for family was made so that Chinese families could keep their heritage in books like they have for millennia, but now taken to a more modern place. And finally, my own thesis was IOAs, which was a way of creating playful infrastructure so that people can understand how money works in their own tiny cities. So as you can see, the reason I'm showing this is design is going places that are really diverse, right? And who's investing in this? Well, I'm not going to go into much depth in here, but basically IBM is investing $100 million to expand their design business. They want more designers inside. Fidelity Investments has made huge investments in this. Publicis, which is an advertising group, has bought a bunch of design consultancies. Goldman Sachs now has an internal innovation team that is made of designers, BNY Mellon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big deal. Design is becoming a big deal in these places. But this is the part where I'm always wondering, where is game design? Right? What has game design done to tackle this, or why hasn't it? And what is our thinking behind this? And if you look at game design, most of our discussions are in the beginning, right? Is design a product? Is design art? Is design an engineering thing? That's the typical discussion, right? Is design. What is games, right? Everyone's like, what are they? Are they art? Am I expressing myself, or should they not be? Should I be selling them to someone? There's always this discussion, but in reality, I am way more interested in what is design more than what is games, right? What is design in games? What are we talking about when we design games? What makes it different? What makes it special? And what makes us better designers, I think, than many other designers? So let's start by breaking down the way we're already looking at this. If we look at how companies are working right now, I just told you that companies are starting to have like this innovation teams in design, right? But if you look at game design companies or game studios, and this is very broad, so please don't shoot me. I know it's not always like this. But if you look at it, you usually have like the creatives, right? Production, sometimes. Game design, art, audio, engineering, right? There's people that are the creative part, the part that is actually making the art. And then you have the people that are more the management part, the entertainment part, publishers, management, communication and branding, HR, finance, the people that were usually like, oh, they don't get it. But they're necessary, right? There's always like this division in our heads. But if you look at the middle, what's happening, and this to me is fascinating, more and more we're starting to be in need of UX and the live services team and the esports team and community management team and product management team. And this is happening more and more and more, and we don't know where to place them. They're kind of like this weird in between, and to me that's what starts looking more and more like design strategy. When we're realizing that, oh, hey, we're making services, we have users, we need some weird hybrid in between. And while I was talking to Paolo Malabullo, who's the head of design at Netflix, I've been asking a lot of people in the industry, like, where do you place design strategy in games? Because no one seems to be doing it, right? What we have is a few teams in UX, but they're kind of seen like as a nuisance. And so what to you is UX? Because I realized that he was at Microsoft for a while as a game designer. I think it was Microsoft, yeah. And he said, you know, to me, ultimately UX design in games is game design. This was to me mind-blowing, right? Most people might not think it is and think UX design is simply about user interface, but that's not true. Game designers are the UX designers in the game industry. It's one of the major reasons why I migrated to game design when I went to the games industry and not just UI design for games. That was when I started realizing that game designers have something inherently special. Right? And I started thinking, okay, that's interesting. If we've always been doing this, why are we not positioned as the stronger ones, the ones like leading the way in this new way of looking at the world, right? So in that question that I started asking, you know, is that really so? Are we great at user experience? Are we all user experience designer? What does that mean? So I started looking at how game design companies are using UX right now. And there's this talk when I went to GDC this year that I think is very good by Celia Hodent, I think it is. She's at Epic Games, and she just started their UX team like a year ago, 2 years ago. And to her, the definition of UX is kind of like this person that mediates between what the user wants, player. Let's start there, we call it differently, right? What the player wants and what the designer thinks. To her, that's like what UX should be all about. And she realized while she was trying to input this into our game design teams, into Epic Games, that the dev team was like, I don't know, why do we need UX? Right, like I already know how to do this. It feels like they're throwing a bunch of information at me, and UX doesn't seem a priority. Whereas for her, UX became more of like a user research thing, where she could give you scientific facts that I also found really interesting. That's not how I look at design at all. But then they started working together in different ways, and now they have their own process where they test and build. And this is starting to look way and way more like what I showed you design thinking looked like, right? This idea of like, we look at a problem, we have hypotheses, then we realize that there might be a way of iterating that. We build, we test, we report, and then we go all the way back again. But that's great, but it's still looking at the user experience of the player. And I think that's the crux of why, as game designers, many people are skeptic of UX. It seems like we've done that before by testing and failing with people. And it also feels limiting, right? It feels like what UX is doing in games is research. Because the other part, the part of defining what's going to work with my player, how are we going to make it happen, how are we going to iterate it, we've done that before, right? So to me, the most important thing about design in games is actually starting to think beyond that and think about what other users can there be. And this is a question that we haven't asked ourselves yet. I think this is why design strategy is not seen as an important thing. Because we haven't looked inwards. We haven't looked at what other users we have. We just look at players, and we know how to do that pretty well. So we always go, why UX, right? Or why design in this case? But some people are starting to look at it differently, and this is my first example. So Riot, I didn't know this until recently, and it makes a lot of sense. You know, Riot is basically a service. Right? League of Legends is a service. They didn't design one game, they designed a game as a service, but a pretty good one. I think most people love it. And they've realized that because they're becoming so big, they're having issues of design inside. So they created these positions and these teams that are the player experience manager. And what they do, and they describe it this way, I was talking to Matt Agnello, who's one of the player experience managers there. He said that what they do is they do design for the designers. And this is starting to look more and more like design strategy. They create retreats for designers. They look at pipelines and what's wrong with pipelines and what's good, and then they ideate and create new ideas for this and then iterate. They make ways for there to be better communication across teams, so they create internal tools that can help with that. They create design sprints, they create design workshops, they make different ways for people inside the company to start communicating with each other. And so in this way, design has become a tool for not only looking at the final experience of the player, but it's starting to look more and more like looking at the system of making games. And so more and more design in games is starting to go from we make a game to, oh, we need to look at how we're making the game, and we need to look at how people are experiencing the game, and we need to look at how we can make those two things work better with each other. And I think that kind of design could lead to us tackling what are the biggest issues in design in games right now. Not designing games, but design in games, which is first prototyping and scale. I'm going to talk about each of them in a bit. Prototyping and scale. When do you stop prototyping? When do you realize that you need to do a paper prototype versus a digital prototype, etc. Human production and burnout, crunch. It's a design issue. It means we're not designing our industry well. Full stop, you know, like if we're crunching, something's wrong, right? Something in our system is wrong, because we should be able to, as designers of system, design a better way of designing, right? Games as real services, so is a real service asking people to pay for more every 5 minutes? Are you servicing someone when you do that? I doubt it, right? That's not, to me, that's not good service design. Then distribution, who's getting access to Steam? Why are Steam sales bad? Where all of these questions are things that we can design, right? We can design for them. Come on, we're designers. And then disposal and accumulation. My backlog, my Steam backlog. Why am I buying and buying and buying, and then what happens to it? And even from an ethical point of view, I spent internet and computational power downloading those games. Even buying them. A click is carbon dioxide. So we should be designing for that, right? If we start thinking in our systems thinking, which is what games do really well and what game designers do really well, these are questions that we should be asking ourselves. So I'm going to go a little bit in depth into each one. And also at the end, I'm going to have a question space, but you can also, I didn't say this in the beginning, but you can interrupt me. So the first one that I think is fascinating, and for this one I still don't have an answer, has to do with prototyping and scale. One thing that Stonely Brandy at Riot actually asked me at some point, and I was like, I have no idea. He said, it's so interesting that you're asking these questions, because one of the biggest questions regarding game design is, with physical games, you know when to stop prototyping, because it has to go into production. So it becomes a question of materiality, right? Like, how many board games can we print with this amount of money in this amount of time, and I need to put it out in approximately summer because of this reason. With video games, that doesn't come as easily. Do I start prototyping with paper, but it doesn't really translate, but then where do I go, but I'm not quite sure. And then prototyping in games has become more of like this thing that you get a feel for as you become a better designer, but then it makes it really easy for people to learn, really hard for people to learn, right? It becomes a thing of, I'm an expert and I know how to prototype this because I've done it several times, but for someone new, it's really hard. So what we end up having is a lot of games that never ship, right? That's a design problem. That's a systems design problem, where we could be looking at, well, perhaps what we need to do is get together as designers and think about, how can I teach people this, right? That would be a really interesting way of approaching this problem. So this is a problem that I don't quite have a solution for, but I think it's something that we should be tackling as designers. Then human production and burnout, pretty much we need to tackle crunch. And I think we need to tackle it because the design strategists in other industries are tackling things like capitalism. It sounds huge, but they are, right? They're trying to figure out what is the future of work. So if they are, so can we, right? If those designers can, so can we. Then I also think we should be looking at what real services are. And I think that goes even from thinking about how are we delivering games. There have been innovations there, like having episodic games where you can have, part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That was a huge deal. We don't look at it as a huge deal, but that was an innovation in our industry. And for me as a design strategist, looking at these things is fascinating. And if you look at people that are going into this, now we're having a lot of digital economics designers, right? And live service designers. And that's a new thing, but I think that that's a space where we could go more in depth. Included in that, I think, we should be trying to design new ways of delivering games. Humble Monthly didn't quite work. They're actually struggling a lot. But I think Humble Bundle was an example of an innovation that we can look at as designers and be like, what worked, what didn't, how can we make it better? Which leads me to innovation distribution. This last one, bless you. This last one to me was insane. When I saw Refinery, I don't know if you guys have seen this, itch.io opened up this new way of beta testing your game. And you gotta remember that I I don't know if they're open source, but I know they're free. But itch.io created this way for you to take your community and just, instead of using Greenlight, using Refinery and just like testing out, like A/B testing of your game, you can send certain types to certain users, and you can send it in different time frames. And it's just like, it's brilliant. But that's a design feat, right? That's someone looking at our problems as designers and realizing that we needed these tools and saying, oh, we're gonna design something for that. And that's gonna help the industry as a whole. Few people are doing that, right? And I think this is a really interesting space to go into. A project I have that I'm not gonna go into in this presentation for matters of time, I'm sorry. It's actually a project about how can you get more minorities into distribution, because actually most of the games that are distributed by men. There's a lot of stuff there. But yeah, so we have spaces there too to innovate. I don't know if you've seen it. You can input your username and see how much hours you'd have to play straight in order to be able to play all your games on Steam that you haven't played. Yeah, go on.
One of the things that this just brought something to mind that, because I have a huge collection, I'm one of those collectors, and for me it's not about beating the game. Like, a lot of games I play are not necessarily narrative driven, like have to go and see the end. So, I don't know, some people are like completionists who want to get all the trophies and stuff. It would be hard to be a collector because this would make sense for that type of player. Some players are more like, they sample a little here, they sample a little here. They're not really looking to 100% games.
That makes complete sense. I think one thing in that would be, for example, how Steam is not made so that you can, or there's like a black market of Steam keys, right? Let's start with that. Steam is already designed so that you feel bad about reselling your keys. There's something in there. So what I would say, more than saying that necessarily the problem is that you're a certain type of user, is that there are inherent problems with this that have to do, for example, with carbon dioxide, or you spending a lot of money when maybe someone could have sold it to you for less. Or, you know, so it's an interesting space. I'm not saying there's a solution there. And I think your observation is great. But I think a designer or a games systems thinker would already start asking those questions, and it's a pity that we don't have more people asking those questions. Does that make sense? Yeah, go on.
I was just reminded of, like, there's some person to compare, like, playing games as a young person where you have a limited selection and you have so much free time. It's like you invest so much in every game you own because it's all you have. And then when you're older, it's the opposite problem. You don't have much time, you have a lot of fun, so you're just kind of buying a lot of games and not playing them as much for shorter periods because you don't have the time.
See, that's a cool observation, because as a design strategist, I would say that's a really good insight. What if you have like this sort of mentorship or peer mentorship program where you, as an adult gamer, could give games to people that are younger and tell them, oh, you should play this part because of this, and kind of have like peer gaming instead of peer programming, and you could actually be playing with the person by the side of you. This is just like something I just came up with, but I'm like, oh, that's cool. You know, that would be great. I would love to be playing with children across the world that maybe can't buy it, but I'll buy it for them. I'm not gonna play it, but I'll play from time to time with you and check in with you and tell you what my favorite part of Majora's Mask was. You know, like, there are things there that could be done that we haven't done, so that's pretty cool. So to close this up, our potential as game designers, to me, is that we are systems thinkers. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more, but when we talk about design thinking, and I mentioned this several times, right? They talk about users. They talk about, or in our case, we talk about a player. There's an inherent problem with that, and this is where I think we have the most potential. When you connect to a user or to a player, it becomes a thing of empathy, right? So I understand how you're thinking because I felt like that. It's almost like a very narcissistic thing, right? Like when someone comes up to you and they're like, oh, I'm really sad, and you're like, oh, that happened to me once, I'm sad too because I feel what you feel right now because it happened to me, right? That's empathy. And there's this guy at Carnegie Mellon that I admire a lot called Cameron Tonkinweiss. He's a design theorist, and he says that the problem with empathy is just that the we becomes you and I, and that's it. And so many times when we design in that way, we can't look at the problems in our bigger system. And I think that has happened a little bit in games, right? I want my user to feel scared, or I want them to feel joy and flow, and then all of a sudden we're forgetting that there are other things in our system that need to be changed, right? That I need to be able to sleep. I can't crunch, because it's really hard for me to generate a game that generates heartfelt emotions if I'm so tired that I can't feel emotions. Does that make sense? So there are things that we need to work on, and those things can't be done by empathy. They have to be done by going from understanding users, where we've been for a long while, to understanding systems. And it's going to be debatable, but many people think that games are systems of rules. I know this is debatable, but at least there's an aesthetic of creating a system, an aesthetic of creating a space where things can emerge, but I sort of like make out the edges of what that experience can be, right? Sort of. So, you know, people sort of know how to play because I create a sandbox for them. And when game designers do that, when people that make games do that, they're actually the most brilliant systems thinkers that I've met. I get so much joy out of talking about these things, of talking about climate change and talking about mobility and talking about even like race and all these really huge issues when I talk with game designers. Because it feels like they get it immediately. They're always going from like, but then what happens to this? Then what happens to that? Then what happens to that? You know, you are already thinking about these bigger issues because you create that. You create tiny universes all the time. And that's brilliant. And so my big question is, why are we not exploiting that, right? So if design is devising courses of action to move from existent to preferred situations, what are our preferred situations in the game industry? What are our preferred systems? And therefore, what are our ethical decisions in the industry? There are ethical decisions that as designers we have in this industry because we're systems thinkers. We can't avoid them. We know they're there. We just haven't tackled them for many, many reasons. But actually, I would purpose that if we did, it'd be so satisfying. Those are the big design issues, right? And it's totally okay to make a game because it's fascinating. I love games. But I think we could make better games if we were looking at the systems that surround those games too. So this is my straightforward calling. We all need to make ethical decisions as systems designers. We have to, because they're there. And if we're systems designers, we can't just stand idly and just make a tiny thing. They can be tiny interventions, but we need to know what the consequences are. And mostly because we're in games, we know what they are. We know. It's in our nature, right? So use your knowledge of systems to change the one system you're in, the game industry. If you're going to start somewhere, start with something that you're passionate about. Start changing the game industry. And start in little steps. You can make something like Refinery is pretty big, but you know, Refinery is a little thing. Releasing games in different ways, having a peer mentorship weird system where you teach children across the world how to play games. It sounds huge, but it's actually a tiny thing that is changing the way we approach game design, right? So use that knowledge. And start going there. Start going there. It's fascinating. It's amazing. And it's honestly, again, I believe what we're made for. And it's just going to get more important as we have more issues in the world. It's just going to get more important to use our systems thinking for this. This is what we do. We can look at the aesthetics of systems. And that's an amazing superpower. I believe in this. I believe in this wholeheartedly. So start going there. Position yourselves as the designers of systems that the world and the industry needs. It's a big calling, but you can do it, and I deeply believe that if I can teach anything today or leave you guys with anything, it's that there is a space for you guys to intervene the bigger problems that we have in this industry and eventually in the world. Why not? That's it. Thank you.